So everybody, Dr. Mick King, in his 30+ year career, has managed, lectured, tutored, taught and trained teachers in both ESOL and education. He has taught all level of English and taught education up to the postgraduate level across Europe and the Middle East. His own study has included education, TESOL, education management, and his service to profession has involved TESOL organisation board membership and review work for journals and conferences. His research dissemination has an electric, driven by stone in my shoe approach of finding solutions to problems faced, one which will now validate the assessment reflection. So thank you very much, Dr. Mick King. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this day. I have to be honest, I haven't been able to follow a lot of the day because of different obligations, but I was in the last session about nano learning from Dr. Khaled, really interesting. I've lived in the Gulf region for over 20 years and I've tried many times to learn Arabic and failed. So, you know, I might actually go down that route of nano learning and with Duolingo or something like this and do a little bit every day. And let's see if I get further than I got before. So I don't want to take up too much time talking because I like to talk. I should get down to business because we have got a limited time. And I'm sure some of you, if you've been here all day, you must be exhausted. But hopefully you're also feeling, you know, exhilarated by all the interesting sessions that you've been following today. So I'm going to be talking, I'm going to share my slides in a minute. I'm going to be talking about a reflection. And I know this series is called Innovation in Education. I don't think reflection is necessarily something which is innovative. It's been there for a long time, but maybe we have kind of forgotten about it. And it's something that we should bring back into and focus more on as part of the educational process of our learners and indeed of ourselves. So I'm going to be pitching for assessed reflection today and showing some examples of how I use it myself. And, you know, hopefully there'll be people out there who will be waving the same flag as me and saying, yes, we agree. And other people are thinking, oh, maybe this is something I should think about, because sometimes our work environments don't necessarily give us the space and the time to consider reflection as an assessment tool, even though it is, of course, a very important part of learning. Without reflection, we can't really grow. And as your session, as today's event is all linked to leading to grow, yeah, then I think that reflection has an important part to play in that. So let me just start to share my screen. With my sticky keyboard. And let me just put this on. Just a minute, sorry for that. Let me go back to the beginning. My apologies. Okay, so I'm going to be focusing today on the benefits of using assessed reflection. And the session today will focus on leading to grow and developing both the teacher and the student, although I'll focus mainly on how we can get our students to reflect and how we can assess that. This session is going to argue that reflection can be a key part of growth, and it matters in education, and we should incorporate it in our teaching and in the learning of our students, as well as reflect on our own teaching and performance. So hopefully by the end of the session, you will be able to, or you may be able to, explain the importance of assessing reflection if it's something you hadn't considered before. Reflect on the extent to which maybe a reflective assessment might be incorporated into your own teaching context if it isn't already. And finally, identify, I think there may be one more after this, identify other opportunities for formal reflection in your professional context. It's just those three. So I'm going to start by talking about why reflection is important. And then we'll look very quickly at the differences between traditional and alternative or authentic assessments and the pros and cons of both. the traditional assessment and also alternative assessment. And then we start to look at this concept of reflection. And I'm going to give an example of this as part of portfolio assessment. This is something that happened in the context of COVID, when we suddenly had to go online, and it became, you know, a little bit difficult to conduct summative assessments because of all the issues of cheating and academic dishonesty and so on. So I saw reflection as an alternative that we could use, which would be pragmatic to a certain degree, but also would allow me to, by stealth, to bring in something that I think is important in education, and that is to get students to reflect. Part of this will also be seeing how we can get students to reflect in an additional language when the level is not that high, because that obviously is something that's difficult. How do we do that? And what kind of rubrics can we create to make it understandable for students? And I'm going to end by then looking at other avenues for reflection in education, both for students and also for us as educators. Today I'm going to be sharing my personal examples, which you may, you may do something similar yourself, or you may not. And at the end, you might be able to share some of your own ideas for reflection as well. So at the end, we will be reflecting on reflection. So first of all, why is reflection important? Well, of course, one thing that we don't always consider is that in education, because educational systems sometimes are constructed in a certain way, we don't reflect in education because the educational system doesn't really support that. You know, it's aimed at objective assessment rather than being subjective, looking inwards at oneself. But in fact, reflection, of course, is something that we do all the time. It's a human condition. If we didn't have formal education, we would still learn, because we would reflect on things that happen, and we would then grow and hopefully do those things better in the future. So we all reflect. We'll talk later about critical thinking, and I think critical thinking is an interesting concept, the actual word of critical think, the actual phrase of critical thinking, because as somebody once said in a conference a couple of years ago, someone in the audience said, why do we call it critical thinking? It's just thinking. we think and we make decisions based on what we think. So we'll see later how critical thinking, of course, is a very important part of reflection. So objectivity in assessment often rejects reflection. And this can be due to its subjective nature. It's difficult to measure. It's difficult to put a grade on it. So therefore, we prefer to have objective things like tests and so on. So there is a difficulty in measuring it as a student learning outcome. So we might see in program learning outcomes or in institutional goals that we want our students to be reflective. But once it starts to go into the realms of objectives, then we have to assess it. But how do we do that? And I think in many times it's kind of avoided because people aren't quite sure how to assess it. We do need to reflect to grow. We cannot grow, we cannot learn unless we reflect. So we should assess it, especially as we often include, as I just said, critical thinking in student learning outcomes. Critical thinking, for me, is almost synonymous with reflection. You can't, or at least you can't do one without the other. They go hand in glove, basically. Now, one of the things that I think many of you will be aware of are the various cycles which we use in order to reflect. So Kolb's reflective cycle is probably the most well-known one. And I really wish I could see the chat, because let me see if I can see the chat. I'm afraid I can't see the chat on my screen at the moment. Let me just see. Oh, there we go. Right. Because I'm going to throw out a few questions which I would like you to consider. Let's just go back. So this reflective cycle, is this something that you are aware of? Can you just put in the chat if it's something that you've seen before, just to get a general idea? Just a yes or a no would be fine. Okay. So one person has said yes, no, I haven't. No, okay, great. Okay, so that's something good. So that's something we can learn from. So basically, it's probably one of the most famous psychological models of reflection, where you start with a concrete experience. So something happens to us, or we do something, yeah, and that is our concrete experience. So we will then reflect on that. Okay, we'll reflect on it. We call it reflective, or Kolb calls it reflective observation. We'll review what happened and reflect on the experience. And then we move on to this phase of abstract conceptualization. We will draw conclusions. In essence, we will learn from the experience. And based on that, we will then move to active experimentation. We will either plan and try out what we have concluded and learned, and then the cycle will start again. So let's say, for example, you know, when you're young, when you were a kid at home and you touched the oven when it was hot, yeah, you had that experience, you reflected that, oh my goodness, that hurt. You learn from the experience. I'm not going to do that again. So next time, what shall I do? I'll wear a glove. I'll wear an oven glove. So the next time you wear the oven glove, oh, it doesn't hurt. And that's what you'll do in the future. So that's a basic, very simple concept of Kolb's reflective cycle. And we're going to be coming back to that during the session today. But very quickly, let's talk about traditional versus alternative or authentic assessment and see where reflection should fit in. So traditional assessment, as you know, would be based around exams, quizzes, one-off assignments. It's often quantitatively assessed. There'll be a score at the end. And it's not always, but very often based on knowledge acquisition. We always have a tendency to test knowledge in these kind of assessments. I'm looking at the chat. Hannah, please be careful. Alternative assessments, of course, these are things like projects, portfolios, which are often qualitatively assessed. So they're not a one-off assessment. Often they go in stages, and they usually require evidence of knowledge application. So a student is not just going to say, I know this, they're going to say, I know this and I can do this. I can do something with this knowledge that I have. So if we look at the pros and cons of traditional assessment, of course, the pros are it's easy to administer, often quick to grade. It can show levels of recall, show levels of understanding. It is objective, it is seen as fair, and outcomes are easily measurable. And these are all very good things. You know, we need to be able to do this. But of course, there are some cons. Sometimes, maybe too often, it leads to low-level thinking because we're just testing knowledge. It also is a little bit linked to short-term memory use, so students can cram for the exam, for example. A very important thing here for me is it discourages risk-taking. A student is, if it's high stakes and it's a one-chance opportunity to get a score, then a student might not take a risk in what they're doing. They will just play safe, especially if it's writing an essay or something like this. And it encourages test strategy over what we can call, you know, learning or longer term learning. So how do we do the test? How do we perform well in the test? It can stunt creativity potentially, and high level thinking is less, I'm going to say less visible. To say not visible is maybe too much, but it's less visible in this kind of assessment. But if we go on to alternative assessment, the positives here are that it shows growth, it shows evidence of knowledge application. It often is multi-skilled. You have to apply different skills in order to do the assessment. And it requires higher end thinking skills. If you think of, you know, models of cognition, then we're talking about the higher levels of cognition, so reflection, analysis, and things like this. It requires planning and organization from the learner. It has to be managed, this kind of assessment. And it activates long-term memory because the student will be working on it over a period of time. They are more likely to memorize and remember the experience and the skills that they used and what they learned. But it does have some negatives. For example, it is difficult or more challenging to be able to assess objectively. There could be accusations of subjectivity in the marking and so on. And it's difficult to monitor academic dishonesty. It needs ongoing support, and a longer time is needed to assess. You can't just tick off true, false, or multiple choice answers. And if students are dependent, and maybe your students are dependent if you're teaching, then this can be difficult for them to have to take on this task, which requires so much independence from them. So if we look at portfolio assessment is an example of alternative assessment. And a portfolio can entail a number of different things. Very often it will entail students putting together a series of pieces of work which have been conducted over a period of time. So just like an artist's portfolio, they will bring their portfolio to someone to observe it, and they will put into it a range of their work, probably their best work, if we're being honest. We want students in a portfolio to show their best work. That, of course, in itself requires critical thinking if it has not yet been assessed, because the student has to decide what is their best work and put it into their portfolio. So the kind of work that this might include could be essays, videos, quiz scores, even quiz scores, because the student can point out where they did well in quizzes, test scores, digital products, journals, and of course, reflections, which are put in capital letters, and you'll see that in capital letters in the next few slides. So what kind of skills, competencies, and attributes are required from students in order to do something like a portfolio? Maybe you, just to give you a little chance to interact here, in the chat, you could talk about the kind of skills, competencies, and attributes that a student would need to show in order to do a portfolio assessment. Any ideas? Please put them in the chat. See what you say. Digital literacy, yeah. Good, yes, self-motivation. Good, self-evaluation. Okay, we've got a few ideas there. These are the things that I have research, yes, research skills, absolutely. So I've put here independence or independent learning, planning, because the student has to take control of it and plan it and organize it. They have to apply critical thinking. Somebody wrote writing skills, yes, production skills for sure, because it may include audio and video, some kind of presentation skills, and application of knowledge. And again, I'm putting this word in capital letters, reflection. Self-designed and organized activities. Yes, Fillmore, thank you. Yes, absolutely. So how do we bring in this reflection as part of portfolio assessment? Well, first of all, what should we assess and how should we assess it in a portfolio? We could assess, for example, how well it is organized, how well it is presented. We could take into account scores that have been done along the way in unit quizzes and things like this, and the ability to identify best work. And I think also we can look at reflection on learning. So students should be able to talk about their learning experience and what they have learned in the process of doing the portfolio. And in order to give it some objective validity, I guess, we need to have some kind of rubric, the same as we would have for production skills in language learning, which is my background for writing and speaking. We would need to have some kind of rubric for the portfolio as well. But the content of the rubric would be focusing on the qualitative, okay? Are we describing the quality of the portfolio? So you may have noticed I keep using the term reflection, of course, and I think a portfolio is only effective if a student is able to identify what they have mastered, to what extent, and where they still need to improve. We'll come back to this a little bit later when we talk about ourselves as professionals, but it's not about showing off only and saying, look at me, aren't I wonderful? There should also be the element of like the experience that you had doing this portfolio, where you can identify your strengths, where you can identify your weaknesses, and what you are going to plan to do next, as we saw with Culp, in order to improve the next time. So, and you may find this, that although students do reflect, because it's a human condition, and they think critically in their lives every day, they do not always associate these skills with learning, okay, if they've grown up on rote learning and traditional assessment. And if this is the case, that's not their fault. It's the fault of us, maybe as teachers, or the people above us who value objective assessment as opposed to assessment which allows them to actually reflect and gives value to reflection. So therefore, if you are going to do these kind of things and you want students to reflect, some training and direction is needed. So let's come back to Culp. We're going to look at a very simple example of how we can get students to reflect on an activity that they've done. This is something which I did a few years ago in a previous post that I had. And students had to give a presentation, a 5-minute presentation on a topic linked to sustainability. And if you've ever been with students who have not done a presentation before in their academic career, and that's unfortunately quite common. They come, in my case, I've worked in higher education, but students come and they said, I've never done a presentation before. And they are super, super freaked out by this, and they're really worried about it. So we asked them also to write a reflection as part of their assessment. So they got a grade for the presentation, but they also had to write a reflection. Not a long one, but we wanted them to follow the steps of Culp. And so we taught them Culp and we asked them to write a reflection. So this is the kind of thing that they did. Before I show you an example, I just want to show you that if you are going to get people to reflect in writing or via audio or video, it's really important that you focus, you get them to focus on the idea that part of their reflection, a small part, should be the description of what they did, okay? They shouldn't go into lots of detail about what they did, just say very, very briefly what it is. And the major part should be the actual reflection. So the description should be short so the reader understands what it's all about, and it should serve the reflection. The main part should be the written or audio submission from the student, which is the reflection. And once they have described their concrete experience, which is the description, then they should elaborate on the reflective process as per Culp. So let's look at an example, and I've put the same colors on the left here. So you can see the blue will be where the description is, and the red will be the reflective part of a student giving a presentation. So that's it. That's the description. I made a video presentation and I found it really difficult to keep looking at the camera. That was the experience of a potential student. So then they start to reflectively observe and reflect on what happened. So they might say something like this: I guess this is because I am shy. This could be because I'm the youngest in my family and my older siblings are very self-confident. I feel really bad about this, but I know that feeling bad will not help me. So that's the reflection on what happened. Then comes the abstract conceptualization. I definitely need to build up my confidence, as I know I will need to do more presentations later on in my study. I was wondering if others have the same opinion of me. Do they think I'm shy? I spoke to some friends in class and asked them to watch my video. One of them said they thought it was fine, while another said that my problem was not nerves, they could not see any, but they did say I should look at the camera more as eye contact is so important. So that's the abstract conceptualization, starting to come to draw conclusions about what should happen next. And then if we go to the final stage, active experimentation, it's the plan. The next time I do a presentation, I will bear this in mind. Even if I feel shy inside, others do not see that. So I will try to look at the audience, smile, and do my best. You feel quite confident that this student has thought about what happened, dealt with some misconceptions by getting some information from other people, and they will do a better presentation next time. Okay, good. So I'm going to show you an example of what we did when we had to go online. I was chairing a department called the English Language Center at the Community College of Qatar. And we were suddenly told from one day to the next, we're going online. And of course, our first question was, well, how are we going to assess the students? What's the way we can do it? If we just continue with our tests and just put them all online, then students are liable to rely on other people to do it for them. Culturally here, we can't ask our students to turn on their cameras. So we had no idea what's going on on the other side of online learning. So this gave us an opportunity to bring in reflection into the process. So this happened in the spring semester of 2020. We introduced this, this emergency hybrid portfolio to replace summative assessment to a degree to adapt to the COVID-19 scenario. So for productive skills, it wasn't such an issue because we already had audio and written submissions from students. They were already submitting stuff online and all work was assessed. There was no selection, but we weren't so concerned about that, the productive skills. We were more concerned about the receptive skills, listening and reading. So the reason for this was that, obviously, if we did online tests and it was all summative and objectively assessed, students had the option to cheat. So we thought, let's do something different. Let's try to design a setup where we give the students a quiz, maybe 1/3 of the way through the course, but we don't take the score. So we basically give the student the quiz and the answers. And the student then has to do the quiz and mark it. But then we ask the student to fill in a reflective action plan on the quiz outcomes. So they have to say what they feel about their results. And based on the quality of their reflection, they will then get a score. So we did this in 2 cycles, the first diagnostic quiz and the second diagnostic quiz. And then the final one, we had to do something objective because the college wanted it. So that was an online test where we tried to take as many steps as we could to reduce academic dishonesty. But this is what we tried to do with students whose level from a language perspective was relatively low. For those who are aware of the CEFR levels, we're talking about, A2, A1, maximum B1, the students. So they were limited in what language they could produce to reflect. Now, at the beginning of the chat, if you scroll all the way up, there is a link to a Google Drive folder where you'll be able to find what I'm going to share with you in a minute on the screen. So you're more than welcome to go and have a look at that, or you can just look at the screen. I just want to explain to you a little bit what we did. I've got one eye on the time. I think we started about 5, so I'm going to try to wrap up by 5:40, but let's see how we get on. I'll go through it very, very quickly with you. So that was the basic idea. Before, we would just give students quizzes for listening. There'd be 30 questions and there'd be points. The same for reading. But in the portfolio system, we gave students a quiz, they marked it themselves, and then they had to complete what we called an action plan, because we thought this term might be more meaningful to the students than saying a reflection. And this was for listening as well as for reading. We didn't touch writing and speaking because we already had a system in place for that. So teachers had to create a diagnostic quiz. The quizzes would not carry a grade, but would inform the writing of the action plan, which does carry a grade. So each diagnostic quiz would follow existing blueprints that we used to use for our exams with a certain number of questions. And we gave some flexibility to teachers on how they did this, okay? This was important. It was really important. Sorry, again, my keyboard is not displaying up today. So it was imperative that the students were told that there is no benefit to cheating on the diagnostic test, and doing so will make writing a good action plan which carries the mark almost impossible. So if they got 10 out of 10, but actually hadn't done it honestly, they would have nothing to say in their action plan. So this took some time to try to convince the students to do this, but that's what we did. And then we had to create a rubric, of course, so that we would be able to assess as objectively as possible this action plan. And you have to get buy-in. And of course, some faculty were not necessarily positive about this. They felt it wasn't the right way to go. But I tried to point out to them that it did meet our program objectives, which were listed here, so that it is something that we should assess, that students should be able to make plans to enhance their lifelong learning, reflect on their strengths and weaknesses, show commitment to continuous self-development, apply ethical standards, don't cheat, and self-direct and self-manage their academic and their professional lives. So let's go to the rubric. The rubric is very simple. But first of all, let's look at the action plan. So this is an example with my name in it, okay? So a student would just be asked simple questions. How do you feel about your performance on the quiz? In the box below, explain why you feel this way. So a student can just write some simple sentences. What did you find most difficult and the easiest on the quiz? So these are all things that the student had studied, and they could then say, I found this difficult and I found this easy. Were there other things that affected your performance positively or negatively? For example, where you took the test, the technology, your reviewing, your preparation, so the student could write down some ideas like in the example here. And then time to start reflecting on what you've just written. Look at your answers to question 2. For each part you found difficult, what are you going to do to ensure you perform well on the next quiz? So the student would have to write down some plans for what they'll do next time. And the same would apply then for the reading. This was listening and reading. And then, having looked at the previous 5 questions, can you now write a paragraph in the box below stating how you performed, where you can improve, and what you are going to do to improve? So in essence, we're asking the students to summarize their answers from questions 1 to 5 into a short little paragraph, or in this case, 3 sections below. So that was the idea of the action plan. And it brought something in which we hadn't really done before. We asked students to reflect and we gave them credit for it. Now we had to try to assess this in an objective way. And we did that by creating different stages of the portfolio. was it done? Was it incomplete? Was it completed? Was it completed? And did they do have some extra ideas for each stage? So did they write down 2 comments or 3 comments and so on? So this was how we brought in the objectivity, which we also had to sell to the institution, you know, who might think that this is a little bit wishy-washy, and they wanted that objectivity, and at the end, something which was quantitative to go into the gradebook. So I know I've rushed through this, and my apologies for that, but we are limited by time. But I hope you've got the general idea. And because you have the link to the Google Drive, you can always look at this in more detail if you so wish. Of course, we gave more weight to the sections at the end in the final assessment because they are more challenging. They require more cognitive learning and, of course, more writing. So that was the basic idea of this this method. And so, as I said, the speaking part we didn't assess because we already had something online for that. And students were used to doing writing as part of regular coursework, so the writing was not a challenge for them. They were not used to diagnostic quizzes or reflections, what we call action plans. And this quick transition, coupled with having to meet college-wide emergency assessment requirements, meant this outcome was a compromise. I'm not saying it was perfect, but I think it was something interesting and it got students to reflect. And maybe at the end of the session, you can critique it positively and negatively. I'm happy to hear any feedback that you have. So that was one example. I now want to spend the rest of the time, I've just got about 6 minutes left, I think, to talk about other areas where we can introduce reflection and assess it in our courses. So some other examples from my own context are the following. I'm going to show some examples of these. Reading practice, error log reflection, and then for our own purposes, how we assess ourselves as part of our annual performance appraisal. I'm going to start with reading practice, and I'm going to take you into one of my courses. Let's see if I can clear this so I can, just a minute. Right, unfortunately, I don't know how to get rid of this. Yeah, my tabs, unfortunately, are, wait a minute, are not visible. Okay, I'm going to have to explain it to you. My apologies for that. So basically, what I did here was I tried to get students to reflect on, it's very similar to what we did in the portfolio of ELC. In my current course, our students are particularly weak in reading. So I get them to go and do some online practice where they have the grades, they mark it themselves, and then they go into journals and I ask them some questions in the journals like, what did you score? How do you feel about the score? What do you think you should be doing to try to improve your score next time? That's the general idea. Another thing that I did last semester with students, I tried to focus on error log, on their errors and try to get them to reduce their errors. My feeling is that students have different errors. They don't always have the same errors. So rather than trying to teach everyone the same thing, it's good to get students to look at their mistakes and to try to work out why it's a mistake and to try to stop making that mistake in the future. So I'm going to show you an example here of what I did with students last semester. I got them to, anything I corrected, I got them to keep an error log. So this is a student who would copy paste an error, copy paste my correction, and then make a comment, okay? So in this case, she needed to add S to start, okay? And I said, better to write full sentences so you can easily understand the error. So of course it should be she starts, it should be she starts. and so on and so on. So the students would do this. And then my hope was that eventually they would start to see that they're making the same mistake again and again. And they just need to be a little bit careful and try to reduce the overall number of mistakes. But so an important part of follow-up for this was then to get them to think about what they were doing. So I included a reflective discussion assignment where I asked them to, maybe I'll make this bigger for you, to go back and to look at their error log, okay? Okay, and then answer some or all of the following questions in one paragraph. So the questions asked them, have you repeated the same kind of error? How do you feel about that? How many of your errors are mistakes? You know it's a mistake, but you were careless. And how do you feel about that? For the errors you don't understand, have you asked your teacher to explain? If you haven't, why not? So again, I'm getting the students to think about their errors rather than just waiting for me to grade it and seeing the red and looking at the grade and moving on. They actually have to look at it and try to work out why they made this mistake. And I think this is really important. Have you asked your teacher to explain? I'm kind of accusing the students like, you didn't understand something and you didn't ask me. So I'm trying to encourage them in the class to ask for an explanation, to come to my office hour so I can explain it. The students generally found this quite useful, I think. And this was an example of one of the students' responses, okay? So she said, the discussions that I wrote with Professor Michael John was great, but I can do better than that. And to focus on my repeated mistakes, I must work harder and be careful next time. I didn't read it carefully, just wanted to finish it, etc., etc. So she's thinking about what she did. And she will eventually come up with a plan to try to avoid doing that the next time. I know that time is running out. So yeah, annual performance evaluation. I'll just see if I can have 2 more minutes. I think for us as well, it's really important for us to reflect. And I've been on both sides of the fence. So I've been someone who's, you know, in my career, who's been a teacher who has to complete a performance appraisal. And I've been a chair or a head of department who has to assess colleagues' submissions for performance appraisal. Now, what I can say is that the majority of them do not really reflect with an aim for growth. They tend to be personal adverts for how wonderful each person is. Look at me, I'm wonderful. I did this, and this. Please let me keep my job. Please give me a promotion. Please give me this kind of idea. And that's not what really the college wants to see. It wants to see this desire to grow. So actually wants people to identify in their reflections where things didn't work out and what they're going to do about it next year, where they feel they have weaknesses and areas for growth. The idea is that each year you will have different action plans because you're trying to grow. You won't just be doing the same thing. Now, I don't have time to really to pick out for you some of the examples of my own reflections this year, but I do like doing them. So we have to do a teaching philosophy. So I really I wrestle with the fact that sometimes my teaching philosophy contextually is not, I'm going to come back into this slide actually, is not really working. So I can't apply my teaching philosophy because of my context. So I reflect here to decide how I can actually marry what I believe in with what works in my context. And that's really important, I think. General performance reflection gets you to consider about the strategic goals of the institution and maybe of your department. And to what extent are you actually trying to contribute to those through your performance? Because ultimately you are being hired to do that. So it gives you a chance to really think, am I exerting my energy in the right way in order to achieve what I should achieve in order to meet the goals of my institution, my employer? And do I create enough space within that to also meet my personal goals? Just taking the time to reflect and showing that you're willing to reflect and grow is really important. And if you feel that you are, if you feel that your institution is not going to buy that, then I would suggest that you try to talk to the people in your institution and just ask them, you know, is that what you want? Because I think you'll be surprised. A lot of them are saying that's exactly what we want. We want to see that you have identified your weak areas and you have a plan in place to grow. Right. I think my time is almost up. So sorry if I was rambling a little bit at the end. I was trying to get as much in as I possibly could. So great. That was basically it, everybody. I'm just going to go back to the slides very quickly, just to round them off. And then if there's time for questions, I'm happy to take the questions. So let me just go back and just round off the slides. So if we think about this session, the last 45 minutes, we can in effect apply Kolb's model to reflect. So your concrete experience has been following this session. So keeping the focus on you, okay, this is important in reflection. It's not a critique of other things and other people, it's a reflection on you. What do you think you may or may not do as a result of following this session? Is there anything that you picked up here that you think might be useful? Will you start to reconfigure your approach to reflection and how you reflect personally, how you get your students to reflect? These are the kind of things that hopefully you'll be able to share in the last few minutes. So I'm happy to take any questions you have or any comments. So just to review, the learning outcomes of this session was to get you to be able to be in a position to explain the importance of assessing reflection, the extent to which reflective assessment could be incorporated into your own teaching. Hopefully you've been thinking about that. And also looking at other opportunities for formal reflection in your professional context. The link to the Google Drive is in the chat at the beginning, so feel free, please, to download the PowerPoint and the example of the portfolio, and I'll stop sharing and come back into the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. That was very, very interesting, very deep. And there was not many questions coming, but there is a lot of positive feedback about people wanting to adopt this model for themselves and in their lessons. They're saying it's very engaging and yeah, very, very good feedback. So great. Thank you so much for that.
Most welcome. Most welcome.
And especially thank you for sharing your documents with us and allowing everybody to go away and take something and then use it themselves later. That's really very kind of you.
And I had to speed through a little bit so people have more time to have a look. So yeah.
Yeah, don't worry, you're the last speaker of the day, so you can go on for a little bit. It's absolutely fine.
I'm flexible, so you know, just no.
If I may just inquire, because this was quite it was a lot to pack in. I think a lot of the attendees are going to be processing this for a while. If they do have questions, would we be able to forward them on to you?
Sure, absolutely. No problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I must admit, I do have one myself.
Yeah.
How would you, because obviously when we talk about assessment, because we had assessment before, and essentially reflection is self-assessment. Would you weight more heavily towards qualitative or quantitative style?
Well, I'm a pragmatist. So, you know, there is utopia. If we lived in a utopian society, I'd say let's do qualitative. I would change a lot of things in education if that was the case. But we have to be realistic and we have to meet the needs of institutions as well. So I think that, you know, you have to have an element of objectivity in how you assess it. I mean, that rubric, which I showed very quickly, kind of tries to marry it a little bit, the subjectivity with the objectivity, but it's not really subjective assessment, I would say. It's more trying to quantify something which maybe shouldn't be quantifiable. You know, that should lead, in an ideal world, into a discussion, you know, between a teacher and a student to make a plan together, or to give them like tips on, yeah, I think that's a good plan, and I understand your plan based on your situation. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Paul. I mean, in an ideal world, I'd love it to all be subjective. I think I mean, you could argue that if you have a learning outcome, then you have to assess it. So there has to be a score at the end. Maybe you can say that the benefit of trying to reach that learning outcome can be seen in the scores of other things that students do, like in the quality of their work, improving over the period. Yeah, tough question.
It almost sounds like the attainment of the learning outcomes is the objective assessment, whereas their kind of self-reflection will be the subjective assessment.
Yeah, and I mean, every institution is different, I think, in how they approach this, and even like larger educational systems. I mean, anyone who's been educating for a long time will know that there are waves in what's seen as important in societies, in how you educate and how you assess and how you test. So I think we have over the last 20, 30 years, seen this kind of move towards objectivity, learning outcomes-based assessment, which is good. I mean, I think it gives you some security or some feeling that you are actually, assessing what you say you are assessing, and it brings some accountability into education, which is important. But I do think it's a shame that the subjective side of things maybe get pushed to the wayside because of that. So any way we can find to bring that into this assessment regime is a positive.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I mean, it's a comment I raised before. Obviously, the objective stuff is something that we can then show those in control of the money to show things are improving, but it's the subjective side we probably need for our students' benefits.
And I think if you ask students in the long term, they quite like diagnostic stuff. It's risk-free. It gives them a chance to try, and if they get it wrong, it's not like the end of the world. They can reflect on it rather than getting a low grade. Yeah.
We do have quite a few of our attendees today who actually teach younger students.
Right.
So, obvious question, that what you've obviously demonstrated today is suitable for college level and above, but how would we go about slimming it down somewhat for younger learners?
Honestly, I don't have the experience to sit here as a sage on the stage in that at all, because I don't have that background. But I would just feel that if students are able to write and read, that those kind of questions that I put in that action plan, that could maybe be worked around a little bit, or maybe it could just be done on a small interview, talking to the kids about it. I think this could be would be one way to approach it. Yeah, I mean, it was a challenge for us, dealing with students who were communicating in English, but it wasn't their first language, and they had a low level to find a way. So I guess the experts in the room in early childhood, they will be the ones who actually, hopefully, are now processing in their minds how to do this. How could I actually do this in a kindergarten or a year 1, 2, 3, or whatever.
Yes, it may well be somebody comes up with something and we can stick that to next year's conference. So, no, thank you very much indeed. That's been absolutely fascinating. I've enjoyed that very much. So thank you so much indeed. And yeah, if anybody does have a question after processing all of this today, then please do let us know directly, and we will pass it on to the appropriate speaker and see if we can get some feedback for you. So thank you very much again indeed. I really have enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.